Okay, Chris Smith, you ready? All right. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dave Kopaz. I'm a psychiatrist and integrative medicine doctor and meditation instructor, a bunch of different things, author, artist, um, podcaster. And this is my colleague here, Chris. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, just want to welcome all of you. Thank you for tuning in again. I just want to say we just want to acknowledge that we've had a little time between this particular podcast and our last one. Part of that is due to some of the illnesses and viruses that have sort of blown through at least my house. I think, Dave, you've had some of that as well. So we're
Yeah.
glad to be back. We're excited. Chris Smith, um, family and marriage therapist, meditation teacher, podcaster, um, author, and I think that probably we celebrated our 36th year of marriage. So I think we'll call it there, Dave.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. So, well, what do you want to talk about today, Chris? We could uh never mind, not that. Politics? No, probably not
Yeah,
that.
a little bit of that. I got an idea. Maybe we'll start it out with a story. Would you be all right with that?
Mm. If I said no, would it matter?
No. So at the end of like January 1980, I was in college, and part of what our college asked all of us to do was to fulfill an obligation that they called an RSI, which is responsible social involvement. So in effect, we had to create a plan of social involvement in the community. And so I had thought about this for a long time, and I had friends that did all kinds of things. And I found myself interested in the chaplaincy of being with people in a hospital setting. And so I wrote the chaplain at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital and asked if he would be willing to have me sort of as an assistant for this month in January 1980. And would that be okay? And he wrote back, he said, great, let's. So we set it all up. And so in that January, I found myself in Memphis, Tennessee. And I'll never forget sort of like my first day, I was led through different, hallways and different parts of the hospital. And I have to admit, I wasn't used seeing children with amputated limbs or craning over plastic pails or, just all of the bruises that comes along with intravenous injections. And so at the end of that first day, I knew without um, beyond a shadow of any doubt that I was over my head. I was overwhelmed. And so I went and talked with the chaplain, and which, he was very gracious, very supportive. But he said, one thing that you may want to consider is journaling. And since I already sort of was interested in writing, that came very natural to me. And so that's what I did. I began journaling. And one of the first dilemmas for me as kind of an assistant chaplain was how do I interact and hold space with children who have cancer and their families? And one of my biggest fears was that I would go into a room with a cancer patient or family and say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing, and in effect, add more suffering upon them, which I did not want to do at all. However, with all of that and all of the journaling, Um, Believe it or not, at about day 3 or 4, I met my teacher. And my teacher happened to be a 10-year-old. I'm going to, of course, give him another name, but we're going to call him Billy Jackson.
Oh,
Billy Jackson was from the bluegrass state of Kentucky. And when I met him, he was pale as a hospital sheet, with that sunken dark eyes. But there was just something about him that was inviting and warm. And, again, he's someone that just welcomed me into his life and his family's life. And so, one of the things that Billy taught me that I have remembered to this day, and this is almost 40 years plus, was he was very much about playing, using his imagination and creativity, particularly during these short stretches when he felt a little bit better. It could be 3 in the afternoon, it could be 3 in the morning. If he had one of these stretches of time that he felt better, he would be coloring and, coloring books. He would be watching cartoons with his siblings. He would be like squealing with delight as he took these little trucks and kind of raced across the bed, with these little trucks. I mean, he couldn't go too far because he was still had the IVs. But one of the things that really touched me, that for me was magical, is how he used his creativity, his imagination, really as ways of navigating the uncertain path of cancer and, of course, its treatment. And it always amazed me that here's someone, half my age who was teaching me how really to navigate chronic illness, ongoing medical conditions. Um, so got any thoughts, comments?
yeah. Yeah, before you got to the creativity part, so there's two elements. There's you coming in, as the kind of green um, professional person, and there's Billy Jackson teaching you about how to live with illness and how to use creativity. With looking at it from your perspective, it was reminding me when I teach residents, psychiatry residents, about psychotherapy, they'll often talk about beginner's mind because in the beginning, everyone is worried that they're going to do something wrong and that they don't know what to do. And yet, often they're really good therapists in the beginning, and sometimes they become less good therapists as they go along. Once they think they know what they're supposed to do, sometimes you're a worse therapist than in the beginning, where you're just trying not to do something wrong and just kind of being yourself because you don't have a lot of techniques to hide behind or to throw at somebody. So I don't know. That's what I was thinking about beginner's mind, and then
Can I
uh,
sneak in something with that?
yeah. I wanted to give a Suzuki quote. Should I give that first or afterwards?
Please, I've got a quote too.
Yeah. So Suzuki in um, Zen mind, beginner's mind, says that in the beginner's mind, many options, but in the experts, there are few.
Milton Erickson, who you know is a psychiatrist that practiced in Madison, Wisconsin, had this great phrase, and I was very fortunate when I was kind of learning my chops in therapy to have heard him speak and to meet him. And one of the things that, oh no, not, I'm thinking of someone else. That's not, I was thinking of
Carl
Carl
Whitaker.
Whitaker, not Milton
Yeah,
Erickson.
right,
Sorry.
yeah. Yeah, I didn't know
Um,
Erickson. I didn't know he was from Madison.
no, he was not. He was from another town. So forgive me
Okay.
that.
No,
But
it's
yeah,
okay.
thank you for correcting me, Carl
Hmm.
Whitaker. But he
Yeah,
said, whenever you think as a therapist that you have an idea of what's going on, sit down and, and wait for it to go away. And I always found that to be pretty good advice.
hmm yeah, yeah. That's like the distinction I make with being a healer versus being a technician. So much of what we're trained to do is to be a technician, to kind of do the right thing, to follow a protocol, to treat everybody in the same exact sort of evidence-based way. Versus when you're a healer, you're kind of coming from your heart and your soul. And you don't treat everyone the same when you're a healer because everyone's a different person and you're a unique person. There's a unique alchemy that comes out in that relationship rather than trying to impose a kind of a cookie cutter protocol on somebody.
You had a second point. You had beginner's mind, and then you were going
Oh
to
no, it
make it.
was that quote. It was the quote.
Okay.
I was, oh no, but then so that's kind of looking at things from the trainee or the new professional. Then you also what you were learning coming from Billy Jackson. And I think that's what be fruitful for us to talk about today is that the creativity in the uncertainty of illness or uncertainty of cancer, you said. And Henry, well, what's his name? Ellenberger? I think that might be it. He was a Canadian psychiatrist and wrote a book on the history, something like of the discovery of the unconscious. And he wrote about creative illness. And he had this concept that sort of like shamans would, go into this period of illness that was part of their training. It was part of their calling to become a shaman. In a way, they became intimately, personally acquainted with illness in order to be able to heal illness in others. And Ellenberger also saw that Freud and Jung both had these periods of time where they had, like Jung's encounter with the unconscious, the period of time that led up to the Red Book. Um, and Freud, he also charted out a time where people went in. I started to think of it almost as like a preoccupation. People had a preoccupation with some idea that sort of churned them around and kept them caught in the surf. And the preoccupation led to the occupation. That you can think of preoccupation two ways, like an obsessive kind of interest in something, or you can think of it as your training for the occupation. But, like Jung would say, those were the best years of my time when I was working with those images, and all of my later career has just been almost like a footnote from that time.
Hmm.
And Ellenberger then said that there's a transformation of the personality that would come out of the creative illness. Then that the challenge is how do you get out of that loop when you're stuck in that loop and you're still, you know, turning in the negativity? How do you somehow get to where you go from the preoccupation into the occupation?
And so, from your experience, how do you do that?
I'll define now. Ongoing practice. I mean, um, I think it's not something that's done one and done type of thing. I think it's willingness to enter into that uncertainty and to let go of your, like with a professional, you're holding on to that idea of a therapist. But with illness, I think you're holding on to the idea of who you are as a person and how the world should be. And the feelings of this isn't fair. We shouldn't have to deal with this. And all those like, Kubler-Ross stages of death and dying of like, I'm angry about having illness. I'm bargaining about having illness. Maybe if I did this or did that, or, I'm depressed about having the illness. I'm in denial of having the illness. I'll just act like I don't have it. And then eventually somehow you get to this magical acceptance.
This is something I've been giving actually a lot of thought to recently. And one of the challenges I wanted to ask myself with my own particular ongoing medical odyssey is what are some of the things that have either buffeted or have helped me to sort of move out of that cycle that you were talking about? And so some of the things that came up for me, one of the first things was connection is key. That
Mhm.
this idea that relationships matter maybe more than anything. Just like each genuine connection, whether it's a friend, a therapist, a support group, a neighbor,
Mhm.
a person at the post office, or even a stranger who gets you at least a little bit, kind of adds this generous deposit into your emotional and spiritual bank account.
Yeah.
And to me, each connection, at least for me, reminds me to some degree of who I am, maybe on my better days, that I'm not alone, and this possibility that I'll be able to move beyond this, or I'll be able to get through this. Um, the other thing that this is kind of a funny,
Hmm.
but the other thing that I wrote about was fostering frenemies.
Hmm.
It's like, do you have friends that laugh and make fun of you? Hint, hint, Dave.
Hmm.
The type who refuses to be sympathetic, no matter how sick you feel. Um,
Hmm.
what came to me is keep these friends. Uh,
Hmm.
reason being is that for me, they return me to myself over and over again, reminded me that I'm not solely a diagnosis or a stool sample.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I got a couple more, and then I'll hand it to you.
Okay.
The other thing is that I thought of was comfort and cotton.
Hmm.
And I thought about, for me, the importance of comfort, of having things that are comfortable. Like I have a beloved blanket. Mine's old, it's threadbare, it's worn
Hmm.
out. Old Winnie the Pooh blanket that we had when our kids were eating only hot dogs and macaroni and cheese. And
Uh-huh.
so in some ways you wrap yourself up into like 90% nostalgia with 5% cotton and 5% polyester. But this idea that, again, you're kind of offering yourself this hospitality, right?
Yeah.
And then I
It's
thought
like
the
a
other,
cocoon, sort of like you're
yes,
creating this cocoon of self comfort,
yep,
that
yep.
connects you to something in the past.
And then something, I mean, I could go on this, but the other thing that we
Uh-huh.
both share is there's power and purpose. This even in illness, to me, this question of what gets me out of bed in the morning besides urgency to get to the bathroom, right? What are you passionate about? There's a Dr. Caroline Leaf, and she is a communication pathologist among many other things. And she says that your purpose is not the thing you do. It's the thing that happens in others when you do what you do.
Yeah.
And maybe I'd say it a little differently. I would say your purpose is the thing that gives you and others joy when you do it. And so to me, that has been particularly helpful.
Hmm.
Um, and then something that I think we both share, again, this idea of what might help us in this circle that sometimes we
Yeah.
can find. This thing I also think you and I share is that humor is holy. So I had
Hmm.
a morning, after visiting the bathroom the 25th time, I
Hmm.
opened the bathroom door and turned to my wife, and I remarked, "It's official. I'm living the life of an asshole, just like my father and stepfather." And she laughed, and I had this, feeling like just a little control, maybe not over
Hmm.
the body in that moment, but certainly through humor. And for me, there's power there if we dare.
Hmm.
It doesn't always removes, I would say, the
Hmm.
darkness of the disease, but it gives better lighting
Yeah.
that might be necessary for the days
Hmm.
ahead. So those are just a few things.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a couple thoughts. One was when I got diagnosed with cancer, my friend Joseph Rael, asked me, well, why did you get cancer? And so I started to think like this Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's things of, something I did, anger, depression, something I did wrong, something I should have done, bargaining, all these different things. And then he just kind of stopped. I was cycling, and he just sort of stopped the cycle and said, it's because you're still in training. And then that kind of broke that cycle. And then that's kind of given me a trail out of that sort of being stuck in this sort of churning, because whenever I get to a point of like, why me, woe is me, oh, I hurt, all this different stuff, instead of being trapped within myself, I can see that as like it's helping something larger. There's a larger process that I can learn and grow from this, and that I'm more than just this momentary experience of suffering or illness.
That's great.
Yeah. I've got this model that I developed, looking at Carl Jung's Red Book and Philip K. Dick's Exegesis.
Would
Yes.
you mind just spelling out what the red book is?
Yeah, yeah. So both of these, the Exegesis and the Red Book, were posthumously um, published kind of journals that both Philip K. Dick and Carl Jung used. It was almost like their workbooks, like when you talked about the journaling that the chaplain told you to do. It was kind of like not these professional things. It was their attempts to try and figure out what the heck is going on in this experience. So Jung's, he has all these paintings and archetypal symbols and these communications with his soul. And Philip K. Dick's was about these sort of, you're always trying to figure out, and he's trying to figure out, am I psychotic or am I a mystic? Is this God? Is this some scientific, some sort of science fiction thing, some um, artificial intelligence or some extraterrestrial intelligence that is so far beyond us that we might as well call it God? And it goes back and forth, trying to figure it out. And Jung, too, he's kind of going back and forth. Am I losing my mind or not? And it's interesting, both these books were published then within a short span of each other. And so I got both of these huge books and kind of read through them. And the Red Book, I don't have the of the picture Red Book. I've got just the reader's version here. So this is just the text. And then the exegesis is, it was like thousands of pages. And so this stuff that they published is just an excerpt of it. It's like 900 some pages. And he's got sort of different drawings here. Oh, this is perfect. See this drawing right up here with those sort of loops back and forth.
Can you move it down just a slight bit? There we go. Yeah,
Yeah,
I got it. Yep. They
yeah.
look like fish.
Right, right. So he's talking about the fish, the Christian fish, and two arcs and the sign, and then like a DNA helix. And so I developed this model. Look, after reading both of them, I was like, they both went through this intense experience that was, some people thought was psychotic, some people thought was spiritual and divine. And they went back and forth with this, trying to figure it out. And then they spent all this time like just writing and writing and writing and exploring in their journals. And somehow they figured something out. Something clicked at some point. And then throughout both of these books were things that the authors would refer back to, but without kind of like letting people know about it. Like Jung published some of his paintings and said a patient did this painting, but it was actually him. He didn't want people to know it was him. And Philip K. Dick would quote, things from his own exegesis. And so this, I was interested in a couple different levels. One, just the idea of this kind of secret diary that is kind of it's sort of play secret, because you're like, I don't want you all to read this because you'll think I'm crazy. But at the same time, it's so good that I have to like share it with you. Um, but I also, with this, sort of both of them had difficult childhoods. Their life kind of went along, and then they hit this occupation or preoccupation point where they started to churn and churn and churn, and they couldn't move forward. And both of them then went backwards and did this kind of self-analysis. So they kind of closed the sine wave into a helix by going back all the way to their childhood, and then started going from their childhood back to this point. And then the thing that got both of them out was like a divine invasion, is what Philip K. Dick called it. Was some sort of spark of the divine that then helped them see that what they were going through was actually their training.
This is
And then they were able to move forward. The preoccupation was like a little sine wave, and then their occupation was kind of amplified. They kind of but they were aligned with it, with their purpose, power, and purpose, like you said. They sort of engaged with it, and instead of fighting it, they accepted it.
It's really cool. You're
Yeah.
reminding me, I think I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but sort of book three that I'm still kind of working on final edits and um, but it's
And
a
just to mention that book two is not published, but you're
right, right. It's final edits too, working on it. Um, but I'm trying to explore that theological question, and I really one of the things I go into it looking the horizontal. And what I mean by the horizontal is that I'm not sure that we can ever truly understand the divine, the vertical.
uh-huh,
And so I work, all through this book exploring the horizontal relationship that we have with each other. And after all of that work and through reading, studying, I kind of come to this at least understanding that happened kind of in the writing that if there is a God, it happens to really to occur to the extent that we care and that we show each other compassion. That and I read a little bit, and I may not have this
uh-huh,
exactly right, but that's what um, Abraham Joshua Herschel sort of wrote about it, I think, in his first PhD thesis, and then kind of changed it later. But then as I'm working through this book, Dave, I
uh-huh,
get to the very end of the book, and it occurs to me in this like moment that just kind of explodes in my brain that what started this whole book was this thought that came out of nowhere. And I had this thought, that's the vertical. And
uh-huh,
so at that moment, it helped me to understand that both are present simultaneously. At least that's my
uh-huh.
understanding. And
Yeah.
that was kind of like a huge
Uh-huh.
um, understanding for me.
Right, right. And when you have them both, it makes a cross. Or
Right.
the medicine wheel, from an indigenous perspective, it's when you're in the center, and then, everything can be moving around you, but you're also in the center. I
Yeah.
thought about this a lot. I've been sort of collecting talks about the horizontal and the vertical. And who was it? Professor Schacht, who was my philosophy professor, studied Nietzsche, um, studied with him. I can't remember who it was. I think he was a German theologian. That's anyway. He had this idea of the vertical and horizontal, and then in the indigenous perspectives, Joseph Rael talk about the black road and the red road, and in the medicine wheel, um, the black road sort of runs this way, so it runs from the mental to the physical, and the red road, which runs this way, it runs from the emotional to the spiritual. And so it's almost like, and I think of our society, we've covered everything with asphalt, you know. We've got these black roads everywhere, and we've lost the vertical. Um, and so, how do we bring this vertical in? And then thinking about melanoma, melanoma means, black, it's black growth. And so I was thinking the black growth, the black road, being stuck on this, kind of dark road that's part of our existence, but then trying to figure out how to bring this other road into kind of counterbalance it and to wonder, do we need both of these? Like in some Native American traditions, they'll talk about the good red road. And like Black Elk spoke about a period of time when he was on the Black Road, which was more about war and conflict, and the Red Road that was more about spirituality and peace. And I kind of, just my holistic thinking, I kind of like to think we sort of need both of them. There's times when we have to go on this black road. The black road could be illness, we want to be on this red road of, spiritual and emotional kind of good feeling and, everything feeling really good and purposeful. And then there's this other road that just kind of sideswipes it that no matter how far you go on it, you don't get anywhere from a red road perspective.
You think from the red road perspective, is that, I'm not going to ask this
Yeah.
question
Hmm.
really well, but is that something more of grace, something that we can't
Hmm.
do?
Hmm.
something that,
Yeah,
um, gosh,
that's
no
the
matter how
divine
hard we work.
invasion,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
divine invasion that comes
yep,
in, and then somehow, it gets you out of the two-dimensional into, a three-dimensional perspective.
yeah, yeah. Another thing that I was looking at, um, that for me has been helpful,
Mm.
although not as helpful as I wanted it to be.
Uh-huh.
I thought about mindfulness, and I put mindfulness a must. And I think to me, one of the things is when you're, at least for me, when my body feels like an unsolvable Wordle puzzle,
Uh-huh.
no solutions, that for me, this practice, which I almost feel like for me, it's more horizontal. It's like it's
Hmm.
paying attention. It's sort of things that I'm able to at least lean into, the present moment,
Hmm.
and to do that with as much kindness and compassion, which again varies on the day. And to me, in some ways, it becomes a way to slow down. It kind of throws the anchor out of the boat,
Hmm.
when the winds are blowing and the waves are doing their thing, and it just slows down enough for this possibility of the vertical.
Yeah.
Not that it happens, not that, it's like it's not a prerequisite, but it for me it's that practice that is a way of sort of bringing soft hands to
Hmm.
embrace to hurting place, um, that at least may slow me down to hear something beyond my own thoughts.
Yeah. It's interesting that distinction because you could be on sort of the black road where you're in the material. Everything's a materialistic thing, and you're just using the world in a material aspect. But then the presence or the mindfulness is almost like it creates this space within it where there's this spiritual experience within the material.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. One of the teachers that I've talked with, named Jim Finley.
Mm,
Jim Finley was a student of Thomas Merton,
mm,
and Thomas Merton was a famous Trappist.
mm-hmm.
Um, but Jim Finley has this great thing. It says, "The absolute love of God protects us from nothing, even as it sustains us in all things. Protects us from nothing,
Yeah,
uh, even as it sustains us in all things." And to me, that brings in a little bit of this vertical and horizontal.
yeah, yeah. There's a phrase of being capable of God. I think I heard them, like in Henry Corbin writing about the Sufis, of making oneself more capable of God, and everybody experiences the God that they're capable of, and that the spiritual path is to try and become more capable of God. And I think that the flip side of that is also becoming more capable of suffering,
Yeah,
um, so that you kind of have to open up both of these. So that protects us from nothing makes me think if you're protected from nothing, you can experience everything.
yeah,
And yet, experiencing everything is difficult for the ego or the mind to kind of hold. How can your mind hold everything? And so, part of that, again, that getting stuck in something is where you've hit the limit of what your mind will allow in. Joseph Rael talks a lot about, there's this experience he had me do of like walking across just the floor, like walking across the floor and pausing and experiencing these different things. I got this image of like, um, he talks about we don't exist. But then there's these times we do exist for these brief moments. And the way I kind of made sense of it and from his teaching was it's like we're going along on this, black road, or we're just, going along on the materialistic road. We hit a wall. Eventually we realize that wall is a door. When we open the door, we step into new experience. But that room is something that we're not supposed to stay in. It's a room that we, maybe get comfortable in, then really the goal is to get to the door on the other side of the room. So the spiritual path is really continually letting go of the room that you've become comfortable in, and it's really looking for the door that leads you into the next larger room.
Yeah. I wanted to, as we kind of explore
Yeah.
imagination and creativity in illness and disease, one of the things I wanted to share a little bit is my wife, for almost 10 years, has been teaching watercolor to persons that have different levels of dementia. And one of the things that to me has been very fascinating about, again, bringing creativity, imagination through visual arts with persons, again, that have different levels of dementia, is this idea of the process of you know bringing a brush to dry paint to canvas, that in that particular moment, um, that person is transported to the moment or a special time in their life. And it could be the image of a farmhouse. We have lots of rural persons in my community. It could be the family dog. But in reconnecting these sort of moments, one can rekindle their life that had been disconnected by this disease. And what's so amazing to me about that moment is you can see it in their face. And if a family member is there, you could see just this moment where everyone connects in this one particular, through the art. They're able to kind of touch each other in a familiar way, even though it may be, momentary, and how healing that is for everybody, the family, the person with, again, somewhere in the continuum of dementia, the person that may be teaching the class. But again, to me, it brings out this perspective of how important creativity and imagination is, and how, I mean, you and I have talked about this, how in some ways it may be a gap in how we go about inviting healing. How many times have I been to different providers and they would say, in addition to taking this pill and this particular pill, how you doing with your story writing? Have you been drawing anything? Um, that to me would be pretty remarkable if there was a provider who said to me, in addition to this, I'm going to prescribe art for you.
Sorry, I muted myself for a second. Yeah. How are you making use of your illness? Like there's that phrase, never waste a crisis.
Don't waste your suffering.
Yeah, don't waste your suffering, right? Put it to some good use. Um, yeah.
I feel
Well,
like,
huh? Go ahead.
just because I had a conversation with a pain doc in the sauna a few weeks back, and we were talking about this very thing that you just said. Is I said, well, what if at the end of your appointment, which I know for him is very short, I
Yep.
said, what if you would say, I've got a little homework for you. Um, and again, you don't have to do it, it's optional, but how might you use your suffering?
Hmm.
How might you use your suffering? And he said, well, I would be afraid that if they'd come back, they would talk about it. And I said, that's a great idea. Give them something to think about, plant a seed. But
Yeah.
this idea of, using, like you're saying, your suffering in some creative way, to me, it's not a cure, but it's
Uh-huh.
certainly something that I think can be very supplemental and very supportive.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can we look at our suffering or illness as a gift rather than an affliction, something that is helping us to, continue our training? And I'd like to read a little bit from Lewis Hyde's book, The Gift, Creativity, and the Artist in the Modern World. And Hyde thinks a little bit of a distinction, like we could look at a black road and a red road, or the horizontal and the vertical. Of the horizontal is commodifying what you've made and making money off of it, versus the vertical of this is a gift and I'm sharing this gift. So he makes a distinction between the uh, the commerce culture and the gift culture. That in a gift culture, when you give something away, you're richer for it. Whereas in a commerce or commodity culture, when you give something away, you've lost that thing, and then somebody else has that commodity. So he talks about it's the assumption of this book. I'll show the book there, the gift. It's the assumption of this book that work of art is a gift, not a commodity. Works of art exist simultaneously in two economies, a market economy and a gift economy. A work of art can survive without the market, but where there's no gift, there's no art. And a gift is a thing we do not get by our own efforts. So again, it's this sort of, you know, this divine invasion or this grace or this, thing that Joseph Rael says to me that kind of knocks me out of this place. It's something that we have to make that effort when we're churning around. But the way we get out of that churning is ultimately not by our own um, power. It's almost like somebody throws you a life preserver or a rope or something. So he talks about the intuition or the inspiration of a gift, and that along with any true creation comes the uncanny sense that I, quote, I, the artist, did not make the work.
Yeah.
Here's a quote from D.H. Lawrence: not I, the wind that blows through me, says D.H. Lawrence. And I know you and I have talked about this at some point because we've both written books, and we wish these books would have a life. It's kind of like giving birth to something, and you wish this book would go out there and people would enjoy it. And then also too, we kind of wish that we'd at least break even, to have some financial recompense instead of, it being a black hole that we're, throwing all this time and energy and money into, and then tried different marketing things or doing talks. And there's a part of me that's always like, oh, I'm doing this big talk, or I'm doing something's getting published in this journal, this national or international journal. I bet people will be interested, and they're going to take a look, and they're going to be like, I wonder if this guy's written a book, or he mentioned this book. Maybe I'll go and I'll buy some of his books. And then I always look on Amazon to see, did I get any book sales out of that? And almost always it's no. Or occasionally, something big will happen and I sell one or two books. And so there's this sense of like wanting to have a sustainable life as a writer. I'd love in retirement to, start doing less and less clinical work and more writing. But at this point, the writing doesn't bring in any money. The more I write, the more money I spend is what it seems like. And I read this marketing advice that I kind of follow that I don't think is very good advice, but you're following it too, which is the best advertisement for your book is to write another book. So here's what Lewis Hyde eventually, he says, there are three primary ways in which modern artists have resolved the problem of their livelihood. They've taken second jobs, they've found patrons to support them, or they've managed to place the work itself on the market and pay the rent with fees and royalties. And that's what I think a lot of us, even if we're thinking of our work as a gift and we're thinking of our work as something that we can't do, um, there's still this sense of like thinking, wouldn't it be great if I could live off of this gift? Um, so, and then he kind of talks through here uh, he says that the people who take a second job, it frees the art from the burden of financial responsibility so that when you're creating the work, you can turn away from questions of market value and labor in the protected gift sphere. So you earn a wage in the marketplace and you give it to your art. That's kind of what I think of now. I've got my day job, where I'm a psychiatrist and all these other things, and that supplements my writing. But I wish I had more time for writing because I'm doing so much on my day job that I'm often worn out or don't have the time to do the writing. Um, The artist who takes a second job becomes, in a sense, his or her own patron. See if there's anything else here. But he talks about too, if you look too much at your art and your gift as a market value, you can destroy your own gift. Like if you're only trying to become successful, you're not actually, your eye is interfering with the inspiration of the gift. So I don't know. What do you have to say about all this, Chris?
Yeah, yeah. Very true. I shared with you before we started recording that I've been looking at marketing in terms of, what are ways to put my work out in the world a little bit, some of this creativity, thinking that it's been helpful for me, and I'm thinking, well, maybe it will be helpful to others.
Hmm.
And I have to be completely honest. I have looked at marketing. I've talked with people that do this for their livelihood, and I can only do it so much. I just don't have um, I just don't have the desire to take it to that next level where I'm pushing it out on all media. Um,
Self-promoting and yeah.
yeah, I just
Hmm.
can't do it.
Yeah.
Um, I just can't do it.
Hmm. Did you
Oh,
ever read Norman O'Brown,
no.
Life Against Death? There's a chapter he has in there about the filthy lucre, the filth of money. That money is somehow, a dirty thing. And on the one hand, it's easy to say that when you've got enough money. It's hard to say that if you don't have enough money and you're struggling. I mean, you've never struggled. My struggle is just I wish I could do a little bit more of the art side of things. But I mean, many people like, Van Gogh was wealthy during his lifetime. It wasn't until afterwards that his paintings really started to sell. And Philip K. Dick as well. He um, was mostly kind of a kind of schlock science fiction author who was preoccupied with what is reality and what is human and just kept working these themes again and again. But near the end of his life, Blade Runner uh, was based on his book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So he's able to see, he didn't see the release of the movie. I think he saw like a preview of it like before it was actually released, and he had this sense of like, okay, there's my work is worth something. But there's all these people who toil in obscurity because they have to, and they can churn out, like with his exegesis, thousands of pages, of working on something. And I don't know how many books he published in his lifetime. He's got 4 volumes of short stories and I don't know, probably 30 novels or something.
Well, I'm no Philip Dick or a Dave Kopez, but I will say this. One of the questions that I was thinking about is, I practiced marriage and family therapy for almost 30 years, and my license, I let go of my license. And I thought, oh, I thought maybe that's a really bad idea. So I went to look to see what I would need to do to reactivate it, which would be a lot of work.
Oh,
And I had to ask this question, what really matters to me? And where do I have passion around? And although practically, probably spending the time to take the test and the supervision to get relicensed is probably, but I really came down to my passion right now has been writing and doing this consulting, which is not a regular type of thing. And and I had to make this decision. Where am I going to put my energy and time?
mm,
And I couldn't re-up on my license
yeah.
and decided to go this road less traveled.
Uh-huh.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. 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 There's also kind of this archetypal, there's a reality, but there's also the myth of the suffering artist who gives everything um, for their art. And so, and then there's the other side of the coin is you've got to be realistic. You've got to like live in this world. You've got to have a house over your head and all these different things. But then, the monks, the prophets, the mystics, and everyone, they didn't worry about how am I going to be able to pay my health insurance or how am I going to be able to pay this. They gave everything up for this path. Many artists do that as well, and so there's this tension or dilemma of are you living in the horizontal world or are you trying to live in the vertical world and to be too safe in the horizontal world could shut off your access to the vertical world?
Right.
And many people, you read their stories and there's this kind of leap of faith that they take of like, I'm going to go for the vertical world, even though from a horizontal perspective, it seems risky or it seems, financial advisor wouldn't say, you know, Chris, get rid of your license, burn your license.
Yeah,
You
right.
know, go out. Here's all you need to do: get a little bowl and sit on the street and ask people to, donate to you some rice or some leftover food or something or some coffee.
There we go. Um, as we sort of continue, to explore and maybe wind down a little bit of
Yeah,
this
yeah, maybe about 10
creativity
minutes.
and
Mm,
imagination, I'm
mm,
wondering if you would be willing to talk a little bit about a program that you and I talked about when we were teaching whole health in your practice. And this particular program grew out of I think at the William Middleton Memorial Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, and through a gentleman, I think he also is a marriage and family counselor, writer, editor Thor Ringler,
mm,
um, who
mhm.
developed this program called My Life, My Story,
Yeah.
which to me is sort of um, this program that really brings in creativity.
Mm,
And I'm just wondered if you might want to say a few words about that.
yeah. Yeah. So the idea of my life, my story, Thor Ringler developed this program. Um, a way that veterans could talk about their lives, not about their illness, the history of their illness, the history of the present illness, but the history of their lives and what providers might want to know about them, what their doctors and nurses and therapists would want to know about them. And so the way it worked was somebody sits down with the veteran, takes down in their own words kind of a transcript or records it, and then they write it up and they give it back to the veteran. The veteran kind of edits it. And then they put it into the medical record. The electronic medical record has a tab called My Life, My Story. So it's labor intensive because it can take, I don't know, in his program, I think he said it could take something like 4 to 6 hours. But I've found when I've done it, worked primarily with the Native Veteran program that I run, um, it can take months sometimes. First, you've got to establish the trust with somebody. And there's also a lot of time that it takes for people to start to think in that non-medical porting mindset to thinking back to their childhood. And I found it, I mean, it's been very, I think, rewarding for some veterans to feel like it's almost like writing a little book and it goes in their medical record and I give them a copy and then they can share that with their family. But I've also just learned things that I never would have even expected. Like there's a guy I work with who's a Tlingit from the Native Alaskan uh, uh, people. And as we were talking, I was trying to do a little bit of a family tree. He doesn't know what his mother's maiden name was. He doesn't even know his grandmother's real name, his maternal grandmother. And there was such disruption to the family structure of native peoples that there's a sense, as we were trying to write this, there's this sense of like there are these gaps and these places that he didn't know things about, and all this intergenerational trauma
Hmm.
um, that came out. And I really started to think a lot about moral injury and intergenerational trauma. And with this particular guy, we were able to move in this process from him saying that he was kind of um, a neurotic. He studied some therapy as well and done some lay therapy. But he thought of himself as a flawed person, and we were able to shift that to he grew up in a kind of traumatized culture. And so he was able to displace, sort of like, instead of holding all the negative within himself, he was able to see the influence of the negative in his society and culture on him as a person. And it's kind of freed him up to think positively of himself, or at least not actively negative. We shifted over, worked with him for a few years. We shifted over him thinking actively negative about himself to him thinking neutral about himself, to where now he'll sometimes tell me something like, I had this experience where I thought positive about myself, and you would have been proud of that. You would have, thought that I was making progress, and then we talk about the whole process of therapy. But yeah.
You're making me think also that through creativity, we can bring awareness,
Mhm.
however that creativity is expressed. And in that awareness, we can maybe sometimes get a larger picture that can allow us to maybe rewrite our story, the
Mhm.
narrative we might think that may could use a little expanding or editing. And then the other thing I wanted to say that's been true for me, I think it's true in most creativity, is that there's things that you can say and express in creativity and imagination that you can't always express in just
Mhm.
regular life. That creativity gives room for those things that maybe we hold, that we carry, that it's something that you wouldn't talk with the neighbor across the street, but within your studio,
You
or
probably would, but the
yeah,
average person wouldn't talk with their neighbor
with
across the street, right? Mhm.
on a piece of
Mhm.
paper, you
Yeah.
can say it and you can
Hmm.
work it and find a way to say it that really aligns with what you may feel inside.
Yeah. Yeah. You can explore different aspects of yourself. And so again, that circle, when you're in that churning, you could have the divine invasion, you could have grace, you could have inspiration that comes in and helps to kind of make sense of it. From a Jungian perspective too, interesting thing with Jung is, when is something inside and when is something deep inside, and when is it outside? When is it coming from the self, this kind of archetype of the self, which he viewed as this sort of sense of wholeness that was also kind of spiritual, that was in the unconscious, but also it could be seen as something coming from the outside through God or spirit or inspiration, and it kind of, the inside and outside sort of gets deconstructed in a way. But for Jung, it could also be that you churn long enough period of time, and then from the unconscious arises this sort of new way of seeing that's going to, like, opens a door and allows you to move forward, and to the stuff that you thought you were inflicted with or afflicted by becomes this thing that actually is the road that leads you forward. Yeah.
I'm I'm thinking of what we've talked about the past hour, and I'm looking over your left shoulder at Corbin.
Yeah.
We've done a good job of putting him to sleep. I'm thinking, oh, he's looking up now, and and
He went back to sleep.
hopefully we've done a good job of putting all of our listeners to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. Should I end with another gift?
Let's
Yeah.
please do end it with another
Okay.
gift. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is from the gift poems from Hafiz, and this is by Daniel Ladinsky. He calls them translations. There has been a little bit of controversy of whether these are translations or renderings, or you know how they got from the original language into this English language. So I'll just mention that. But so this is called To Build a Swing. You carry all the ingredients to turn your life into a nightmare. Don't mix them. You have all the genius to build a swing in your backyard for God. That sounds like a hell of a lot more fun. Let's start laughing, drawing blueprints, gathering our talented friends. I will help you with my divine lyre and drums. Hafiz will sing 1,000 words you can take into your hands like golden saws and silver hammers, polished teak wood, strong silk rope. You carry all the ingredients to turn your existence into joy. Mix them, mix them.
That's a good way to end.
I think so too. Okay. Bye, everyone. See you next time.
See you next time.